Marcus Thompson had always been a simple man who valued peace above everything else. At 62 years old, he had worked hard his entire life as a carpenter, saving every penny he could to buy a small piece of paradise. That paradise came in the form of a modest lakeside cabin nestled among towering pine trees in what seemed like the middle of nowhere in rural Montana. The cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside. It had weathered wooden walls, a tin roof that sang in the rain, and a small dock that stretched into the crystal-clear waters of Pine Lake. But to Marcus, it was everything he had ever dreamed of. He had purchased the property 3 years ago from an elderly woman named Eleanor Hastings, who had owned it for decades but could no longer maintain it due to her failing health. Marcus spent his weekends at the cabin, fixing things that needed repair, fishing from his little dock, and enjoying the complete silence that city life could never provide. He never bothered anyone, kept to himself, and made sure to maintain his property well. The nearest neighbor was supposed to be miles away, which was exactly how Marcus liked it. Everything changed on a crisp Saturday morning in October when Marcus was replacing some rotted boards on his dock. The sound of hammering echoed across the still water as he worked, completely absorbed in his task. The autumn air was perfect, and the lake reflected the colorful leaves like a mirror. It was one of those moments when Marcus felt truly grateful for the sacrifices he had made to afford this little slice of heaven. That's when he heard the voice behind him. "Excuse me, you there on the dock?" Marcus turned around, surprised to see a man in his 50s walking toward him. The stranger was well-dressed in expensive outdoor gear, the kind that looked like it had never actually been used for real outdoor work. He had perfectly styled gray hair and walked with the confidence of someone used to getting his way. "Can I help you?" Marcus called back, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on his work jeans. The man approached with quick, determined steps. "I'm Robert Kellerman. I live in the new development just over that ridge," he said, pointing toward a wooded hill. "I'm the president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, and I need to talk to you about some concerns we have." Marcus had never heard of any homeowners association in the area. When he bought his property, there had been no mention of any such organization, and he was pretty sure his cabin had been here long before any new development. "What kind of concerns?" Marcus asked politely, though something in Kellerman's tone already put him on edge. "Well, for starters, that hammering of yours has been disturbing our peaceful morning. We have families trying to enjoy their weekend, and the noise carries across the water. Plus, frankly, your property is becoming an eyesore. That old cabin doesn't fit with the aesthetic we're trying to maintain in this area." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He had been working on his own property, on his own dock, at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. If that was disturbing to someone, they were welcome to close their windows. "I'm sorry if the sound of home improvement bothers you," Marcus said, keeping his voice level, "but this is my property, and I was doing necessary repairs during reasonable hours." Kellerman's expression hardened. "That's exactly the attitude we're trying to address. When you live in a community, you need to consider how your actions affect your neighbors. The Pine Ridge HOA has established certain standards for property maintenance and noise levels, and frankly, you're in violation of both." "I'm not part of any homeowners association," Marcus replied firmly. "I bought this property fair and square, and there was no mention of any HOA in my deed or closing documents." "That doesn't matter," Kellerman shot back. "This entire area falls under our jurisdiction now. We've been working with the county to establish proper oversight of all lakeside properties. You can't just do whatever you want anymore." Marcus felt his temper starting to rise, but he had learned long ago that getting angry rarely solved anything. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. My cabin has been here for over 40 years, long before your development existed. I have every right to maintain my own property." "Rights?" Kellerman laughed coldly. "Your rights end where our community standards begin. That ramshackle cabin of yours is bringing down property values for everyone in the area. We've had multiple complaints from our residents about having to look at it." "Then maybe they shouldn't have built so close to an existing cabin," Marcus said, his patience wearing thin. Kellerman stepped closer, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "Listen, old man, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. You can voluntarily bring your property up to our standards, or we can force you to through legal action. Trust me, you don't want to fight us on this. We have resources you can't even imagine." Marcus looked at this pompous stranger who had just threatened him on his own property and made a decision. "I think you need to leave now." "Oh, I'm leaving," Kellerman said with a smirk. "But this conversation is far from over. You'll be hearing from our lawyers soon enough. And if you continue with that hammering or any other disruptive activities, I won't hesitate to call the authorities." As Kellerman walked away, Marcus stood on his dock feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. In all his years, he had never encountered someone so entitled and aggressive. He had worked hard, saved his money, and bought his little piece of paradise legally and fairly. Now some newcomer was trying to tell him what he could and couldn't do on his own land. Marcus picked up his hammer and looked at the half-finished repairs on his dock. He had two choices: let this bully intimidate him into abandoning his weekend project or continue with his work as he had every right to do. The choice was easy. The sound of hammering resumed across Pine Lake, echoing off the water and hills just as it had for the past 3 years. Marcus Thompson wasn't about to let anyone push him around, especially not on his own property. But as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of his troubles with Robert Kellerman and his so-called homeowners association. 2 weeks passed before Marcus heard from Robert Kellerman again, but when he did, it wasn't in person. Instead, he found an official-looking letter in his mailbox when he arrived at the cabin for another weekend of peaceful solitude. The letterhead read Pine Ridge Homeowners Association in bold, expensive-looking font. The letter was filled with legal jargon and formal complaints, but the message was clear. Marcus was being fined $500 for unauthorized construction activities and violation of community noise ordinances. Furthermore, he had 30 days to submit detailed plans for bringing his property into compliance with established community standards or face additional legal action. Marcus read the letter twice, then crumpled it up and tossed it in his fireplace. He had never agreed to be part of any homeowners association, and as far as he was concerned, they had no authority over his property whatsoever, but the letter bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The language was threatening, and it was clear that Kellerman and his group weren't going to back down easily. That Saturday morning, Marcus decided to drive into the small town of Cedar Falls to visit the county courthouse. If these people were claiming to have some kind of legal authority over his property, he wanted to know exactly what he was dealing with. The courthouse was a small old building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1960s, but the clerk behind the counter was helpful and knowledgeable. "Pine Ridge HOA?" the elderly clerk said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Oh yes, they've been quite active lately. Filed a whole bunch of paperwork about 6 months ago claiming jurisdiction over a large area around Pine Lake. But here's the thing." She leaned in conspiratorially. "They can't just declare authority over existing properties that were never part of their development. So they can't legally fine me or force me to change my property?" Marcus asked. "Not unless your deed specifically mentions HOA membership or unless you voluntarily agreed to join. Let me pull up your property records." She turned to an old computer and typed for a few minutes. "Nope, your deed is clean. No HOA restrictions, no easements that would give them any authority. Bought it from Eleanor Hastings 3 years ago, right?" "That's right." "Sweet old lady. Said her family had owned the cabin for decades." The clerk nodded. "The Hastings family built that cabin back in the 1980s. It's been grandfathered in under all the old zoning laws. These new HOA folks are trying to pull a fast one, if you ask me." Armed with this information, Marcus felt more confident, but he also realized he might need professional help if Kellerman continued to escalate the situation. He made copies of all his property documents and headed back to his cabin, determined to enjoy his weekend despite the brewing conflict. But Kellerman wasn't done. On Sunday morning, as Marcus was sitting on his dock with a cup of coffee watching the sunrise, he heard the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs pulled up near his cabin, and out stepped Kellerman along with several other well-dressed individuals carrying clipboards and cameras. "Mr. Thompson," Kellerman called out in a falsely cheerful voice, "I hope you don't mind, but we're conducting our monthly property compliance inspection of the Lakeside area." Marcus stood up slowly, his coffee mug still in hand. "You're on my private property without permission." "Actually, we have every right to inspect properties within our jurisdiction," Kellerman replied smugly. One of his companions, a woman in an expensive business suit, began taking photographs of Marcus's cabin from various angles. "The county clerk says otherwise," Marcus said calmly. "She pulled my deed yesterday." No HOA restrictions, no shared easements, no authority for you to be here. Kellerman's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. County clerks don't always understand the complexities of modern property law. We have our own legal team, and they assure us that our authority extends to all properties affecting the Pine Ridge communities, property values, and quality of life. The woman with the camera was now taking close-up photos of Marcus's dock, including the recent repairs he had made. Another man was measuring the distance between the cabin and the water line, making notes on his clipboard. "I'm asking you to leave my property," Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled. "And we're almost finished with our inspection," Kellerman replied dismissively. "We'll be sending you a detailed report of our findings within the week, along with a list of required improvements." As the group continued their unauthorized inspection, Marcus made his own decision. He went inside his cabin and returned with his own camera, beginning to document their trespassing. This seemed to make some of Kellerman's companions uncomfortable, but Kellerman himself appeared unfazed. "Go ahead and take all the pictures you want," Kellerman said with a cold smile. "When this goes to court, those photos will show exactly how uncooperative you've been." After what felt like an eternity, the inspection team finally finished their work and prepared to leave. But Kellerman had one more surprise. "By the way," he said as he climbed back into his SUV, "we've scheduled a community meeting for next Thursday evening to discuss the ongoing property compliance issues in our area. 7 p.m. at the Pine Ridge Community Center. I strongly suggest you attend." "Why would I attend a meeting for an organization I don't belong to?" Marcus asked. "Because we'll be voting on whether to recommend that the county condemn your property as a public nuisance," Kellerman replied matter-of-factly. "It would be in your best interest to hear what we have to say." As the 3 SUVs drove away, Marcus stood alone on his dock, feeling like he had just been invaded by a small army. The peaceful morning he had planned was ruined, and now he was facing the possibility of losing his beloved cabin altogether. These people were clearly serious about their threats, and they seemed to have resources and connections that a simple carpenter like himself couldn't match. But Marcus Thompson had faced adversity before. He had grown up poor, worked his way through numerous hardships, and saved for years to buy this little piece of paradise. He wasn't about to let a group of entitled bullies take it away from him without a fight. That evening, as he sat by his fireplace, Marcus made some phone calls. First to a property lawyer in the nearest big city, then to a few old friends who might have advice about dealing with aggressive homeowners associations. By the time he went to bed, he had the beginnings of a plan. The war for Pine Lake had officially begun, and Marcus was determined to be ready for whatever Kellerman and his associates threw at him next. What he didn't know yet was that this conflict would reveal secrets about the area that would change everything. The Pine Ridge Community Center was a modern glass and steel building that looked completely out of place among the rustic mountain landscape. As Marcus pulled into the parking lot on Thursday evening, he counted at least 30 cars already there. It seemed like Kellerman had managed to drum up quite a crowd for his little witch hunt. Marcus had spent the week preparing for this meeting. His lawyer, Janet Rodriguez, had agreed to attend with him after reviewing his case. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who specialized in property law and had dealt with overly aggressive HOAs before. "Remember," Janet had told him on the drive over, "don't let them provoke you into losing your temper. They're going to try to paint you as an unreasonable troublemaker. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let me handle the legal arguments." Inside the community center, Marcus was surprised by what he saw. The main room was filled with well-dressed residents, most of whom appeared to be wealthy retirees or young professionals who could afford expensive lakeside homes. At the front of the room, Kellerman stood behind a podium looking every inch the confident leader. "Ah, Mr. Thompson," Kellerman announced as Marcus and Janet entered. "How good of you to join us. Please take a seat anywhere you'd like." Marcus noticed that most of the attendees turned to stare at him as he and Janet found seats in the back. The whispered conversations and pointing made it clear that he had already been branded as the troublemaker in their community. Kellerman called the meeting to order and began with what he called a State of the Community address. He talked about property values, community standards, and the importance of maintaining the Pine Ridge lifestyle that residents had paid premium prices to enjoy. "Which brings us to tonight's main issue," Kellerman continued, clicking a remote that activated a large screen behind him. Suddenly, Photos of Marcus's cabin appeared, blown up to show every weathered board and aging shingle. This property, owned by Marcus Thompson, represents a significant threat to everything we've worked to build here. The photos were clearly taken during the unauthorized inspection of Marcus's property, and they had been chosen and edited to make the cabin look as run-down as possible. Marcus felt his anger rising, but Janet placed a restraining hand on his arm. As you can see, Kellerman continued, this structure is well below the standards we expect in our community. The owner has refused to comply with reasonable requests for improvements and has been hostile to our attempts at constructive dialogue. A woman in the front row raised her hand. What exactly are our options here? I'm glad you asked, Patricia, Kellerman replied smoothly. We've researched the legal precedents and there are several avenues available to us. First, we can petition the county to declare the property a public nuisance. Second, we can pursue legal action for violation of community standards. And third, we can work with local authorities to ensure that any future construction or renovation activities comply with our established guidelines. An elderly man near the middle of the room spoke up. But didn't someone say this property isn't actually part of our HOA? How can we enforce our rules on someone who never agreed to them? Kellerman's smile never wavered. That's a common misconception, Harold. While Mr. Thompson's property may not have been part of the original Pine Ridge development, our authority extends to all properties within our designated area that affect the community's well-being and property values. We have legal precedent on our side. Marcus had heard enough. He started to stand, but Janet quickly stood first. If I may address the group, she said in a clear, professional voice. Kellerman looked annoyed but nodded. Of course. You are? Janet Rodriguez, attorney for Mr. Thompson. I'd like to clarify a few legal points that seem to have been misrepresented here tonight. A murmur went through the crowd. Clearly, they hadn't expected Marcus to show up with legal representation. First, Janet continued, Mr. Thompson's property is not subject to any HOA authority. His deed predates your development by decades and contains no restrictive covenants. Second, your photographs were taken during what amounts to an illegal trespassing incident on private property. And third, there is no legal mechanism by which you can force an unwilling property owner to join an HOA after the fact. Kellerman's confident expression began to crack. That's your interpretation of the law, counselor, but we have our own legal team that disagrees. Then perhaps your legal team should speak with the county attorney, Janet replied calmly. I took the liberty of discussing this case with his office yesterday. They were quite interested to learn about your claims of authority over non-member properties. The room fell silent. Several residents began whispering among themselves, and Marcus could see doubt creeping into their faces. But Kellerman wasn't finished. Legal technicalities aside, he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, the fact remains that Mr. Thompson's property is negatively impacting our community. If he won't voluntarily improve his property, then we need to explore other options. Such as? Asked the woman named Patricia. Kellerman hesitated for just a moment, then seemed to make a decision. Well, for example, we could file noise complaints with the sheriff's department every time he does construction work. We could challenge any permits he tries to obtain. We could even organize protests on the public portions of the lakeshore. Marcus felt his blood pressure rising. These people were talking about making his life miserable simply because his modest cabin didn't meet their aesthetic standards. Furthermore, Kellerman continued, warming to his theme, I happen to know that Mr. Thompson has been doing electrical work on his property without proper permits. That's a code violation that could result in his power being shut off. That was a lie, and Marcus couldn't stay quiet any longer. He stood up, his hands clenched at his sides. That's completely false. I haven't done any electrical work, and you know it. Please sit down, Mr. Thompson, Kellerman said with mock politeness. You'll have a chance to speak when we open the floor for comments. I'll speak now, Marcus said firmly. Since you seem determined to spread lies about me and my property, I think everyone here should know the truth. The room was dead quiet now. Marcus could feel every eye on him, but he pressed on. I bought my cabin legally and fairly 3 years ago. It's been there for over 40 years, long before any of your expensive houses existed. I've never bothered anyone, never violated any real laws, and never asked for anything from any of you. All I want is to be left alone to enjoy my retirement in peace. But your property, someone started to say. My property is well maintained and up to code, Marcus interrupted. The only problem with it is that it doesn't cost $500,000 and doesn't have marble countertops. If that offends your sensibilities, then maybe you should have thought about that before building in an area that already had existing homes. Kellerman's face was red now. Mr. Thompson, you're out of order. This is our meeting and you're harassing an innocent man, Marcus shot back. You've trespassed on my property, taken unauthorized photographs, sent me threatening letters, and now you're spreading lies about permit violations. I've had enough. As Marcus and Janet prepared to leave, Kellerman played his final card. Before you go, he called out, there's something you should know. I've already contacted the sheriff's department about some concerns regarding your property. They'll probably want to speak with you soon. Marcus turned back to face him. About what? Kellerman smiled coldly. Oh, just some reports of suspicious activity. People coming and going at odd hours. Unusual noises, that sort of thing. In times like these, law enforcement takes community safety very seriously. The threat was clear. If Marcus didn't back down, Kellerman was prepared to make his life very difficult indeed. But as Marcus looked at the smug faces around the room, he realized something important. He wasn't going to be intimidated by these people, no matter what they threatened to do to him. The real battle was just beginning. Sheriff Deputy Maria Santos had been patrolling the Pine Lake area for over 8 years, and she had never received a more bizarre 911 call than the one that came in on the following Saturday morning. 1. What's your emergency? This is Robert Kellerman, president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. I need to report a dangerous situation at 47 Lakeshore Drive. There's a man there who's been making threats and acting erratically. I'm concerned for the safety of our community. Deputy Santos knew the Lakeshore Drive address well. It was the old Hastings cabin that had been sold a few years back to a quiet carpenter named Marcus Thompson. She had met Marcus once during a routine patrol and found him to be polite and harmless. What kind of threats, sir? He's been verbally aggressive during our community meetings, and there are reports of suspicious activities at his property. Power tools running at odd hours, strangers coming and going. Some of our residents are afraid he might be dangerous. Santos sighed quietly. She had been getting complaints about the Pine Ridge HOA for months. They seemed to think that owning expensive homes gave them the authority to police the entire area. I'll send someone out to check on the situation, she told Kellerman, though she suspected this was more harassment than a real emergency. When Deputy Santos arrived at Marcus's cabin 30 minutes later, she found him sitting peacefully on his dock, reading a book and enjoying the morning sun. There were no signs of dangerous activity, no suspicious visitors, and no threatening behavior. Morning, Mr. Thompson, she called out as she approached. Marcus looked up and smiled. Good morning, Deputy. What brings you out here on such a beautiful day? Well, we got a call about some kind of disturbance. Mind if I ask what you've been up to this morning? Marcus held up his book. Just reading and enjoying the quiet. Haven't seen another soul all morning until you arrived. Santos looked around the property. Everything seemed normal and well-maintained. Have you had any visitors lately? Anyone who might have seemed suspicious or caused problems? Only Robert Kellerman and his HOA friends, Marcus replied with a wry smile. They've been trespassing on my property and threatening me with legal action because they don't like the way my cabin looks. Santos nodded. She had suspected as much. Mr. Kellerman called 911 claiming you were making threats and acting dangerously. He seemed to think you posed some kind of safety risk to the community. Marcus set down his book and stood up, his expression serious now. Deputy Santos, I've lived in this county for over 20 years. I've never been arrested, never been in a fight, never even gotten a speeding ticket. The only threat I've made is to continue living peacefully on my own property despite their harassment. That's what I figured, Santos said. Between you and me, we've been getting a lot of complaints about that HOA. They seem to think they can use the sheriff's department as their private security force. As if on cue, the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. 3 cars pulled up near the cabin and out stepped Kellerman along with several other Pine Ridge residents, including the woman with the camera from the previous inspection. Deputy Santos, Kellerman called out as he approached. Thank goodness you're here. Has he been cooperative? Santos turned to face Kellerman, her expression professional but cool. Mr. Kellerman, I need to ask you why you called 911 to report an emergency when there clearly isn't one. What do you mean? This man is a danger to our community. Just look at this property. It's obviously not being maintained to proper standards. Property maintenance isn't a police matter unless there are actual code violations, Santos replied. And even then it would be handled by the county inspector, not emergency services. Kellerman's face began to redden. But he's been making threats.
He disrupted our community meeting and refused to comply with reasonable requests.
What kind of threats? Santos asked, pulling out her notepad. Well, he was verbally aggressive and hostile. He clearly has anger management issues. Marcus spoke up quietly. Deputy, I attended their meeting with my attorney. The only thing I said was that I wanted to be left alone on my own property. Santos looked back at Kellerman. Is that the extent of these threats you reported? Before Kellerman could answer, one of his companions, a well-dressed man in his 60s, stepped forward. Officer, perhaps we should discuss the broader issues here. This property is clearly bringing down values for the entire area, and we have rights as property owners to— Stop right there, Santos interrupted. First of all, I'm a deputy sheriff, not a property value assessor. Second, what you're describing isn't a law enforcement issue. And third, calling 911 to report false emergencies is actually a crime. The group fell silent. Kellerman looked like he had been slapped. Now, Santos continued, I'm going to need all of you to leave this property immediately. You're trespassing on private land without the owner's permission. But we have a right to inspect. The woman with the camera started to say. No, you don't. Santos cut her off. This isn't your property, you're not government inspectors, and you have no authority here whatsoever. If you don't leave immediately, I'll have to arrest you for trespassing. As the group reluctantly began walking back toward their cars, Kellerman made one last, desperate attempt. Deputy, you don't understand the situation here. We represent significant property values and tax revenue for this county. Surely the sheriff's department has an interest in protecting legitimate taxpayers from— Mr. Kellerman, Santos said firmly. Mr. Thompson is also a taxpayer, and he has the same rights as anyone else. If you continue to harass him or make false emergency calls, you'll be facing charges for both harassment and misuse of emergency services. After the HOA group left, Santos turned back to Marcus. I'm sorry about this, Mr. Thompson. Unfortunately, this kind of thing has been happening more often lately. It's not your fault, Deputy. I appreciate you handling it professionally. Santos hesitated for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. Can I give you some unofficial advice? Of course. These HOA folks have been causing problems all over the county. They seem to think they can bully people into compliance through intimidation and harassment. But they've picked the wrong county to try this in. What do you mean? Santos smiled slightly. Let's just say that the people who really run this county don't take kindly to outsiders trying to push longtime residents around. If I were you, I'd document everything they do. Every trespass, every threat, every false complaint. Sooner or later, they're going to cross a line they can't come back from. As Deputy Santos drove away, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since this whole ordeal began. It seemed like not everyone in positions of authority was impressed by Kellerman's wealth and connections. But that afternoon, Marcus received a call that made him realize the situation was about to get much more complicated. Mr. Thompson, this is Eleanor Hastings. I believe you bought my family's cabin from me a few years ago. Mrs. Hastings. Yes, of course. How are you doing? Well, that's what I'm calling about. I've been hearing some troubling stories about problems you're having with some newcomers up there. Is it true they're trying to force you off your property? Marcus explained the situation with the HOA, the threats, and the false 911 call. Eleanor listened quietly, occasionally making small sounds of disapproval. Mr. Thompson, she said when he finished, I think it's time you knew something about that property you bought. Something I probably should have mentioned when we did the sale, but I thought those days were long behind us. What do you mean? Eleanor's voice took on a serious tone. The cabin and those 40 acres weren't just my family's weekend retreat. They were part of something much bigger. Something that these HOA people have no idea they're messing with. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about, Mrs. Hastings? I think we need to meet in person. Can you come see me tomorrow? There are some papers you need to see and some family history you need to know about. Trust me, Mr. Thompson. Once you understand what you really own, Robert Kellerman is going to be the least of your worries. Eleanor Hastings lived in a modest assisted living facility in Cedar Falls, about 30 miles from Pine Lake. When Marcus arrived at her small apartment on Sunday afternoon, He found a sharp-eyed woman in her 80s who moved slowly, but spoke with the clarity of someone whose mind remained razor-sharp. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Thompson," she said as she invited him in. "I should have told you all of this 3 years ago, but honestly I hoped it would never matter. Sit down, please. This is going to take a while." Eleanor's apartment was filled with old photographs and documents, many of them spread across her dining room table as if she had been preparing for this conversation. "First, let me ask you something," Eleanor began. "When you bought the cabin, did you ever wonder why I was selling 40 acres of prime lakefront property for such a reasonable price?" Marcus had wondered about that, actually. The price had seemed almost too good to be true for such beautiful land. "I figured you just wanted to sell quickly because of your health," he said. Eleanor smiled. That was part of it. But the main reason was that I needed to find the right person to sell to. Someone who would love the land and take care of it, not someone who would turn it into another development like those Pine Ridge people. She pulled out a thick folder filled with yellowed documents and old photographs. "Marcus, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound incredible, but every word of it is true and documented. My great-great-grandfather, William Hastings, came to this area in 1887. He wasn't just a settler. He was one of the original land grant recipients from the federal government." Eleanor spread out several old maps and land patents across the table. "William received what was called a railroad grant, a huge tract of land given to encourage development of the Western Territories. But William was smart. Instead of selling off pieces like most grant recipients did, he held on to everything and passed it down through the family." Marcus studied the old maps, trying to understand their significance. "How much land are we talking about?" he asked. Eleanor pointed to the maps. The original Hastings grant covered over 12,000 acres. It included all of Pine Lake, the surrounding forest, and most of what is now 3 different counties. Over the years, the family sold off pieces here and there, but we always kept the core property around the lake. "But I only bought 40 acres, Marcus said. Confused. "That's where it gets interesting," Eleanor replied with a gleam in her eye. "You see, when my family started selling land in the early 1900s, my grandfather was very clever about how he structured the sales. He sold development rights and surface rights, but he kept what's called reversionary clauses in all the deeds." Eleanor pulled out another set of documents. These clauses meant that if the land was ever used in ways that violated the original spirit of the grants, or if certain conditions were met, ownership would revert back to the Hastings family trust. Marcus felt his heart rate increasing. "What kind of conditions?" "Well, for example, if anyone tried to force the original trust properties into involuntary associations, or tried to claim authority over them without proper legal standing. Also, if the county government ever tried to condemn or seize trust properties without just cause." Eleanor stood up slowly and walked to a filing cabinet, returning with a legal-sized folder. "Marcus, when I sold you that cabin, I didn't just sell you 40 acres. According to the terms of the original trust and the reversionary clauses that have been triggered by recent events, I sold you the position of primary trustee for the entire Hastings land grant." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Eleanor said with a satisfied smile, "that you now own or control approximately 8,000 acres in this county, including all of Pine Lake, most of the surrounding forest, and the land that Robert Kellerman's precious Pine Ridge development sits on." The room seemed to spin around Marcus.
"That's impossible."
"Wouldn't something like that have shown up in the title search?" "Not necessarily. The reversionary clauses were filed as separate documents in the 1920s, long before modern computerized records. Most title companies don't go back that far unless they have a specific reason to. But I've been paying the taxes on the trust properties for decades, and all the documentation is right here." Eleanor opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Property deeds, tax records, surveyor maps, and legal filings dating back over a century. "The key document is this one," she said, pointing to a particularly old piece of paper. "It's the original trust agreement from 1923. It states that the trust remains active as long as any Hastings family member maintains residence on the original grant land. When I moved to assisted living, that technically violated the residency requirement. But I'm not a Hastings family member," Marcus pointed out. "No, but you are the legal purchaser of the primary trust property, which makes you eligible to assume the trustee position under the emergency succession clause. And here's the beautiful part, Robert. Kellerman's attempts to force you into his HOA and his threats of legal action actually triggered the protective clauses that activate the full trust authority. Marcus felt like he was in a dream. Eleanor, are you telling me that I own the land that the Pine Ridge development is built on? Not exactly own, but you control it as trustee. The Pine Ridge developers bought their land from various sellers over the years, but none of those sellers had clear title to transfer. They all bought from people who had purchased surface rights only, not the underlying land ownership. Eleanor pulled out a modern-looking document. I had my lawyer research this thoroughly before deciding to contact you. According to his analysis, most of the Pine Ridge development was built on land subject to the Hastings Trust, which means the trust, which you now control, has significant legal authority over those properties. What kind of authority? Well, for starters, you could require them to pay ground rent for the use of the land. You could also impose reasonable restrictions on land use to protect the natural environment. And most importantly, you could prohibit the formation of any homeowners associations or similar organizations that might interfere with the trust's authority. Marcus sat back in his chair, trying to process this information. Eleanor, why didn't you tell me any of this when you sold me the cabin? Because I honestly thought the trust would just fade away when I died. I never expected some group of wealthy bullies to come along and try to push around the new owner. But when I heard what they were doing to you, I realized that the trust protections were more important than ever. Eleanor walked to her window, which looked out over the distant mountains. My family preserved this land for over a century, Marcus. We fought off railroad companies, mining corporations, and developers who wanted to destroy its natural beauty. We're not about to let some HOA bullies succeed where all those others failed. She turned back to face him. The question is, what do you want to do with this information? Marcus thought about Robert Kellerman's smug face, the unauthorized photos of his property, the false 911 call, and all the threats and intimidation he had endured. What are my options? Eleanor smiled. Well, you could simply assert your authority as trustee and order the Pine Ridge HOA to cease all activities on trust land. You could require them to pay back rent for the past several years. You could impose new environmental restrictions that would make their current development non-compliant. She paused dramatically. Or you could really have some fun with this. What do you mean? The trust agreement gives the trustee broad authority to protect the land and its residents from outside interference. That includes the power to file criminal trespassing charges against anyone who attempts to assert unauthorized authority over trust properties. It also includes the right to seek damages for any harm caused to trust assets or residents. Marcus felt a slow smile spreading across his face. Are you saying I could have Robert Kellerman arrested? I'm saying that Robert Kellerman has been trespassing on trust land, taking unauthorized photographs of trust property, making false claims of authority over trust assets, and harassing the duly appointed trustee. Yes, I think criminal charges would be entirely appropriate. Eleanor handed him the folder of documents. Take these to your lawyer. Have her review everything and verify what I've told you. And then, Marcus Thompson, I think it's time to show Mr. Kellerman and his friends what happens when you mess with the wrong piece of property. As Marcus drove back toward Pine Lake with the folder of documents on his passenger seat, he couldn't stop grinning. For weeks he had felt like David facing Goliath, armed with nothing but a slingshot against an army of lawyers and wealthy bullies. Now he was beginning to realize that he might actually be Goliath after all. Janet Rodriguez had seen a lot of unusual cases in her 20 years as a property lawyer, but nothing quite like what Marcus Thompson presented to her on Monday morning. She spent 3 hours reviewing Eleanor Hastings' documents, making phone calls to verify records, and consulting with colleagues who specialized in historical land grants. Marcus, she finally said, looking up from the pile of paperwork, this is absolutely legitimate. Not only that, but it's ironclad. The Hastings Trust has clear legal precedent, proper documentation, and current tax records. You're not just the owner of a cabin anymore. You're the trustee of one of the largest private land holdings in the county. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now we go on the offensive, Janet replied with a grin. I'm going to file a motion with the county court to officially recognize your position as trustee, and then we're going to send some very interesting letters to Mr. Kellerman and his associates. That same afternoon, Janet hand-delivered a legal notice to the Pine Ridge HOA office. The document was formal, thorough, and devastating in its implications. The notice informed Robert Kellerman that he had been conducting unauthorized activities on land controlled by the Hastings Family Trust, that his claims of HOA authority were invalid and illegal, and that he had 48 hours to cease all activities related to the trust properties or face criminal trespassing charges. Furthermore, the notice demanded immediate payment of back rent for the Pine Ridge Development's use of trust land, totaling approximately $2.3 million for the past 5 years. Kellerman's response came within hours, in the form of an angry phone call to Marcus's cabin. "This is ridiculous," Kellerman shouted into the phone. "You can't possibly own our entire development. We have clear titles to all our properties." "Actually," Marcus replied calmly, "you have surface rights only. The underlying land ownership has always remained with the Hastings Trust, which I now control. You should have done better research before you started building. This is extortion. We'll fight this in court." "That's your right," Marcus said. "But while you're fighting it, you're still trespassing on trust land. I'd suggest you read the legal notice more carefully." The next morning, Marcus got a call from Deputy Santos. "Mr. Thompson, I have some interesting news for you. Mr. Kellerman called our office this morning demanding that we arrest you for fraud and extortion. And, well, I ran your legal filing past our department's legal advisor, and then I called the county attorney. Turns out you're not only legitimate, but the county has been looking for the Hastings Trust Administrator for years. Why? Because the county has been paying property taxes to a trust account that nobody could locate the administrator for. There's about $50,000 in back payments sitting in an escrow account, waiting for the rightful trustee to claim it." Marcus almost dropped the phone. "You're kidding." "Nope, and there's more. The county attorney says that if your claims hold up, which they appear to, then several major developments in the area may have been built without proper authorization from the actual landowner. This could affect dozens of properties and millions of dollars in real estate." That afternoon brought another surprise. Marcus was sitting on his dock when he heard vehicles approaching, but this time it wasn't Kellerman and his HOA friends. Instead, 3 official-looking cars pulled up, and out stepped several people in business suits, including a woman he recognized as the county commissioner. "Mr. Thompson," the woman called out, "I'm Commissioner Patricia Walsh. Could we have a word with you?" As the group approached, Marcus noticed that they seemed respectful rather than confrontational. Commissioners, county attorney, and tax assessor, Commissioner Walsh introduced the group. "We understand you've recently assumed control of the Hastings Family Trust." "That's correct," Marcus replied carefully. "Well, sir, we have a situation," the county attorney said. "Your trust apparently owns or controls a significant portion of the land in our county, including areas where we've approved development projects without realizing we needed trust authorization." "What does that mean for those developments?" Marcus asked. "That depends on you," Commissioner Walsh replied. "As trustee, you have considerable authority over how that land is used. Some of these developments could potentially be forced to shut down if you choose to exercise your full rights." Marcus thought about this for a moment. "What would you recommend?" "Honestly, we'd like to work with you to find solutions that protect both your rights as trustee and the legitimate interests of current property owners. Most of these people bought their homes in good faith, not knowing about the underlying ownership issues. I'm willing to be reasonable with people who are reasonable with me," Marcus said, "but I'm not feeling very generous toward those who have been trying to harass and intimidate me." Commissioner Walsh smiled. "We heard about Mr. Kellerman's activities. Between you and me, the county has been looking for a way to rein in some of these aggressive HOAs. They seem to think they can override county authority and local laws." The county attorney spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, we have a proposal. What if we work together to establish a proper framework for the trust lands? You could retain your authority as trustee while allowing existing developments to continue under agreed-upon guidelines." "And what about the Pine Ridge HOA?" The officials exchanged glances. "Well," Commissioner Walsh said carefully, "any organization that has been operating without proper authority on trust land would need to restructure their activities significantly." That evening, Marcus got a call from Eleanor Hastings. "I heard through the grapevine that things are moving quickly," she said with obvious pleasure in her voice. "Eleanor, I still can't believe this is all real." "Oh, it's real, all right. And I heard something else interesting today. Apparently, Mr. Kellerman has been calling everyone he can think of trying to find a way out of this situation." Word is that he's discovered his development's financing was based on clear title assumptions that may not be valid. What does that mean? It means that his investors are starting to ask some very uncomfortable questions. When you're dealing with millions of dollars in loans and property values, having the underlying land ownership called into question is a very big problem. The next morning brought the final piece of the puzzle. Marcus was eating breakfast when he saw a familiar car pulling up to his cabin. Robert Kellerman got out alone, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. "Mr. Thompson," Kellerman called out as he approached. "Could we talk?" Marcus stepped out onto his porch but didn't invite Kellerman any closer. "What can I do for you, Robert?" Kellerman looked like a man who had aged years in just a few days. I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the situation here." "Really? What kind of misunderstandings?" "Well, it appears that our HOA may not have had the authority we thought we had, and it seems that you have more significant property rights than we realized." Marcus waited for him to continue. "Look," Kellerman said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "I may have been overly aggressive in my approach. Perhaps we could work something out that would be mutually beneficial." "I'm listening. What would it take for you to allow our development to continue operating? We have families living there, significant investments, mortgages." Marcus looked at this man who had threatened him, trespassed on his property, taken unauthorized photographs, made false 911 calls, and tried to force him from his home. He thought about all the stress and worry Kellerman had caused him over the past month. "Robert," Marcus said finally, "I'm willing to work with the county to establish a reasonable framework for existing developments. But your HOA's days of bullying people are over. You're going to dissolve the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association and cease all attempts to control properties you have no authority over. And in return? In return, I won't pursue criminal charges for trespassing, harassment, and filing false police reports. I also won't demand the full back rent your development owes the trust." Kellerman's shoulders sagged with relief. "That seems unfair. Oh, and Robert, one more thing." "Yes?" Marcus smiled. "You're going to apologize. To me, to Deputy Santos for wasting her time with false emergency calls, and to every person you've harassed in the name of your HOA's fake authority. Yes. Of course." As Kellerman walked back to his car, Marcus couldn't help but chuckle. A month ago, he had been a simple retired carpenter who just wanted to enjoy his lakeside cabin in peace. Now he was the trustee of a vast land holding with the power to control development across multiple counties. But the best part wasn't the power or the money, or even the sweet taste of victory over his bullies. The best part was that his little cabin on Pine Lake was safe forever, protected by over a century of legal precedents and family dedication to preserving the natural beauty of the area. Marcus Thompson had started this fight just wanting to be left alone. He ended it as one of the most powerful landowners in the county, with the authority to ensure that no one would ever again try to push around a peaceful person who just wanted to enjoy their little piece of paradise.